Welcome to the Gold Hoops and God podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Guerra, and today I have a fantastic guest. It is Dr. Jackie Hidalgo. Yay!
Hello.
Hello. It's so good to have you. So Dr. Hidalgo is a faculty member at the University of San Diego in the Theology and Religious Studies department. I have known Jackie for some years now, and Jackie's been very kind on this wild ride of academia. So many a story, right, Jackie?
It's been a wild ride for sure.
It's been a whirlwind in a lot of ways. Yes.
Never
Totally.
what you would have expected, right? So
never. It's like a surprise for real.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So I'm really excited to have you. And per usual on my podcast, I like to begin with thinking about culture and identity. So I'll invite Dr. Hidalgo to share a little bit about her background and upbringing and how you understand your Latina identity.
Yeah. Thank you, Lauren, for the invitation. It's great to see you in your professional recording digs and everything. So yeah, we won't talk about how long I've known you. As people may or may not know, when we met at the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, right? We met at an Octus meeting, and that's a space where it's starting to shift, but I'd say that there's like kind of three major Latino ethnic groups that have been part of Octus, right? And that would be ethnic Cubans, Mexicans, and Puerto Ricans, right? And so you and I had in common being, at least in part Central American in background, which I think, things have shifted. There are more Central Americans now, more South Americans now, but I always felt that part always felt a little outside the norm too, right? So I was born in Costa Rica, but my mother is from the US. But I think that, I'd even start by saying, when you sort of asked earlier before we started recording about what the kind of varieties of Latinidad, like that's already in and of itself. Costa Ricans are pretty small diaspora in comparison to other parts of the broader Latino community in the United States. But I was born in Costa Rica, moved to the US when I was a baby. I've been back to Costa Rica a fair amount to visit family, but I've never really lived there except for a couple of times when I, sort of took long school breaks there. So maybe 6 weeks at a time, but I've never really lived there. When we first came to the US, we were in New Orleans. I don't remember that at all. I've seen photos, but I don't remember it.
Interesting. Wow.
Really, my first sort of memories in the U.S. start from when we were living in a small town outside of Denver, where I lived from about 4 to 12. And, I think I mentioned this because I think it matters very much for who I became and how my politics of Latino identity got shaped. Because at that point in time, I was living in a town that was, and my school was probably a mix of white and Mexican American. And so my sort of first senses of being different were really around being Costa Rican and not being Mexican in background, and so like that was a sort of, initial sense of being different. I remember being in elementary school at some point and doing something, and someone said, "Oh, that must be because you're Costa Rican," and I was like, "What? What does that mean?" And so like I hadn't really given it a lot of thought. And then when I was just before I turned 12, we moved to the Kansas City area. And that was a huge change. Kansas City is very different. And especially when I was growing up there in the 1990s, it was a city that was very segregated, very dominated by white evangelical Protestantism, I'd say. with a significant population of Black Protestants and a significant Black community that was very segregated. You know, something of a small historic Latina community. You know, our colleague Teresa Torres, right, has written a little bit about them. You know, and some others, but it was you know, and again, of my friends growing up there who were Latina in background, they were mostly also Mexican American.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, what happened there was because I wound up becoming a scholarship student at a private school, and that gave me a lot of advantages and privileges in life. Like, I think a lot of what I've been able to do in life comes out of the privilege of having been at this elite private school. And one of the privileges of it that I don't know that I registered or understood as a privilege at the time was actually that they brought together some of these other interesting students on scholarship from around the city, but from a variety of backgrounds. So I grew up with, you know, in high school, I felt like I had when I look back, I had a very culturally, racially, and religiously diverse set of friends.
Right.
But it also meant that was when I really started to understand and have a lot of questions about some of the racial dynamics of the United States, the intersections of race and religion. And I always felt like such an oddball in so many different ways, right? Like I had people, and I was lucky enough to always have good friends in so many different places, but also like where I came from and my experiences were always a little bit off of
A
what I
little
think
different.
were the norms for
What everybody
others.
else is doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for sharing. Yeah, I can I can really resonate. It's a little bit ironic. Like, I grew up in Los Angeles, which is the most
Yeah.
diverse of diverse cities you could think of.
Yeah.
And even still, right, it is predominantly Mexican American when you
Yeah.
think of Latinx, Latino population. So being Central American and South American, there's some, you know, there's some Salvadorian, some Guatemalan, but not, you know, in comparison, right? Comparatively,
Yeah.
it skews way higher in terms of Chicano identity and culture in Los Angeles. So
Yeah.
that also has been a very interesting process for me. It sounds like you've also kind of gone through that, considering like what does it mean to be Central American,
Yeah.
especially in academia. I remember specifically like in doing research and stuff, I was like, huh, all these authors are either Cuban, Mexican American, or Puerto Rican, pretty much. I don't see a lot of Central Americans or South Americans in the conversation. And
Yeah.
actually, that is one of the things that I appreciate now in teaching in it's Chicanx and Central American Studies department. My students are Central American, and I highlight Central American books and articles and films. Anyway,
Yeah.
but I really appreciate you sharing that. And it's funny too. I recently got my hair cut with a new hairstylist, and the woman, she asked me, she's like, "Are you Ecuadorian?" I was like, I was like, "Wait, what?"
Wow.
And she's like, "Oh, I saw on your Instagram that you have like a little Ecuadorian flag and a little Guatemalan flag." I was like, "Yeah, I'm my dad's side, we're Ecuadorian." She's like, "Oh, I'm Ecuadorian too." And we were so excited. We had a moment. We had a moment. We were talking about Ecuadorian food and things like that. And she's like, "There's not a lot of us in LA." I was like, "No, there's not." So anyway, it's just very fascinating to think about culture and location, right? Social location. That's a whole thing. So thank you,
Yeah.
Jacqueline. Cool.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love it. um, so it's like, speaking of culture, as we know, especially for Latinx people, there is this deep connection between culture and faith, culture and religion, almost to a sense like it's almost difficult, I think, to separate the two completely, right?
Yeah.
And I for sure have said this in like different contexts, and I plan to write more about this, is that it's not necessarily that a person is religious, not necessarily that they're going to mass or worship every week or once a month. Not, it's more so like the cultural infusion of these practices, or La Virgen de Guadalupe is a huge one, things like that, rituals, that kind of thing, going to baptisms, that, those
Yeah.
sort of things. So I would love for you to share a little bit in terms of like your understanding of your spiritual practices or understandings of like religion. That would be very awesome.
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this a little bit with how to talk about this, because I think like I don't, I don't talk about this as much in my scholarship,
Mm,
even though it's obviously a huge driving force of how I wound up studying some of what I studied and
yeah.
some of the questions that I have. Which is to say that I really agree with you, and I resonate with that description of things. Which
Mm,
is to say that I there are definitely people, and we know them, for whom the entwining of religious and ethnic identity is one where there is a really firm religious belief
mhm,
commitment,
sure.
that
Confessional.
is,
It's like a confession of faith for sure.
it's and something that I would, for lack of a better word, I would describe as very churchy.
Mm,
And I don't know
sure. Yeah,
entirely what
sure.
I
Yeah.
mean by that, but right, I'd say like there are
I got
definitely
you.
people we know, like they're very involved in, parish life,
Sure.
and
Yeah,
like very
that's
involved.
great.
And that has never been my background. Like definitely I grew up going to church,
Mhm,
right? Had CCD classes, etc. But I think one of the things that happened when I look back on it
mhm,
is here was in this very, like I said, Kansas City's this Protestant dominated environment.
mm,
Yeah, I was coming from a certain kind of culturally Catholic
mhm,
background on both
mhm,
sides of my family. And it was important in a lot of sort of cultural layered ways, like you
mhm,
said, right? Like it marks, the sort of family gatherings and celebrations of the ritual of the year. It, when I think about the kinds of images that permeated the space, like
mhm,
having a kind of home altar. I think about this when I visit my dad's
mhm,
house. Even now, my dad would not describe himself as religious or as a religious
mhm,
person, right?
mhm.
And yet, like, and I don't even know that he thinks of it properly as an altar that sits in his living
You
room,
wouldn't call
right?
it that maybe, right?
But it
Interesting.
is
Oh,
definitely an
like,
altar,
but
right?
I see
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I
No,
love it.
it's just the sort of way that these kind of traditions and images permeate the
Mhm,
space.
totally.
And then I think, one of the things I mentioned on the questionnaire is that there's also this other facet of that cultural Catholicism for me
Mm,
that is what, for lack of a better word, is called in sort of study of religion, that piece of it that's highly syncretic. And
mhm,
here, I don't just mean syncretic and people thinking that the image of Guadalupe is both like indigenous and Catholic, right? I
yeah,
mean that, part of being Catholic was also like going to a curandera, going
yes,
to a psychic, right?
yep,
Like
totally.
having like tarot readings,
Uh-huh.
like checking out the horoscope, that these were
Mhm,
all sort of like melded together parts of like a religio spiritual universe that was just part of the
totally.
cultural context growing up. But being in this Protestant dominated environment that Kansas City was,
Mm,
I think I hit a moment as a teenager where I was questioning, because for for especially evangelical Protestants, I think, I don't know, like this is me, speculating based on
mhm,
our years in this field,
sure.
that sort of statement of faith, that sort of claim of here's what I believe, and I am a
Mhm,
part of this religious community because I
mhm,
assert my belief in this like statement.
mhm,
Like that is what it means to be religious in a specific kind of Protestant inflected way. And I knew that I didn't have that. So, like, when I was going through confirmation and we were, part of our confirmation assignments was like we were supposed to read the Bible
Mhm.
and we were supposed to reflect on this biblical passage. And
Mhm.
then we're
Mhm.
supposed to read, it was Pope John Paul II. We're supposed to read his reflections on that biblical passage
Oh,
and then respond to them. And I realized that I like objected to the content of the Bible. I objected to Pope John Paul's reading of the content of the Bible.
hey,
And
I love it.
and so like I was just sort of in this space where I was like,
You were
I
solid from the beginning. Come on, this is very Sor Juana. You know what I mean? Like I love it. Like
it's like I object.
I am
So
exactly.
but like being in this Protestant dominated context where I was like, oh, okay, so objecting to this must mean that I don't belong here, right? And then having these other people in my life who had other religions, right? Like, one of my best friends, her family was Hindu, but she was also sort of,
Mm,
exploring Buddhism when we were
mm.
teenagers. I had another friend whose mother was exploring being Wiccan, and so that sort
Oh,
of brought in like,
yeah.
so
And,
I just got I was like, well, maybe there are other religions that I might like believe in
yes,
more
yes.
or find more interesting or appealing or agree with more, right?
Totally, totally. I love that. And it's so ironic. I'm gonna like backtrack 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Wasn't Luther like the number one objector of all? Like he
Yeah.
had a lot to say.
Yeah.
He's like, I object. And
I
I'm gonna let
object.
the whole world know. Yeah, come on. No, that's very funny. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I love that. No, it's so oh man, this is so cool. Like similarly, I'm grateful that so the private school thing for sure. Uh my parents made obviously like huge financial sacrifices to send me to
Yeah.
private school for elementary and high school, right?
Yeah.
For undergrad I went to LMU, which is private, but that's
Yeah.
that's later but and it was because they were worried about sending me to LA Unified School District, the public school that would have been where I would have been. you know
Yeah.
that's a whole other, the public school, that's a whole
Yeah.
different conversation about schooling and education in the US. But
Yeah.
so they sacrificed a lot. I'm extremely grateful because of the people that I met, because of the teachers that I had, the diversity of people that I met, diversity of thought,
Yeah.
Immaculate Heart High School, it is Catholic, but these are like feminist Catholic nuns that were
Yeah.
running, Corita Kent was, a teacher at the college way back when. And so being around, for example, like my neighbors are Mormon. I actually went to the Mormon girls camp with them at least
Yeah.
once, taking classes. We're like, oh, we're going to take you to a mosque. We're going to take you to a temple to kind of learn about Judaism. I'm grateful for that,
Yeah.
because it allowed me, as and I'm sure it sounds like very similarly for you, it
Yeah.
opens your mind to be more accepting and welcoming of this global reality, like that
Yeah.
people have different belief systems and it's okay.
Yeah.
We don't all have to think the same thing. Yeah.
And that there's something that can be amazing and powerful, and I think, and to the extent that I'd say that what I later found and I can kind of retroactively apply from my
Mm,
academic training is, like I said, it sparked a lot of questions in me about how religion works, what is its intersection with race and
mhm,
culture and power,
mhm,
especially in the US. But I didn't know how to ask those questions at that
mhm.
point.
Right.
What I knew was that I disagreed with the things that were being said in
Mhm,
church, and I thought that that meant that I wasn't a good Catholic,
mhm,
and that meant that I needed to leave.
mhm,
And so I did. I spent a lot of years, I think, just as you described, I sort of like going around examining other traditions. I went to college in New York City, which was an amazing experience. And
mhm,
again, an opportunity to meet so many different people and also to be exposed to a very different kind of Latinidad than what I
Mhm.
had like grown up
Oh, yeah.
around, right?
Yeah.
Very, very different
Totally.
space. And you know, and I think I spent a lot of college actually thinking about converting to Judaism,
Mm.
which, you know, is maybe its own kind of story. I was
Oh,
very, you know, was very interested in that. And I just think there were so many questions, and that's how I found myself studying religion. And
mhm.
I think eventually, to get to your point, I think eventually I did arrive at the fact that no, being culturally Catholic is a way of being Catholic.
Mhm.
And that
Totally.
for me, I am being Catholic in a way that is true to the Catholicism of my family, of
Mhm.
my ancestors. It's a very blended tradition. It's a very family and a home centered tradition. It's not a high churchy one. And it is
That's
not,
oh,
yeah.
yes. That
So,
is really a great yeah, that's a great observation. Mhm. Mhm.
but it
Mhm.
does make sometimes being at Octus feel a little weird because those are a lot, some of them are very churchy.
A
Not
little
all
different.
of them, but
It's a
some of
little
them are
different.
very churchy. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating. I feel like I've had my moments, right? Like
Yeah.
once upon a time, so freshman year at Loyola Marymount, I was all in. I mean, I was a
Yeah.
sacristan, I was
Yeah.
a lector, I was like
Yeah.
Eucharistic minister, ¿qué más? Uh, Christian life community, prayer
Yeah.
groups. I did my confirmation. I mean, the whole thing.
Yeah.
I've had my I've
Yeah.
had my ebbs and flows, but I also now, I mean, as I'm posting like all the time, like
Yeah.
now I'm like more into tarot and oracle readings and botanicas and things like that, which to your
Yeah.
point, that's still me. Like that's all part of who I am and how I was raised and things like that. Um yeah, so I think that's
Yeah.
that's fascinating. That's super amazing. Thank you, Jackie.
Yeah.
Um, oh, I think, I mean, it would be really cool if you don't mind sharing
Yeah.
a little bit more as far as like your research and how kind of like this, this cultural and faith journey experience sort of led you to being a scholar.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's how I think it led me to study religion is probably a
Mhm.
little bit more straightforward based on the
Sure,
things I've told you. How I wound
sure.
up being a biblical scholar is not so straightforward, which I will say more about in a minute. How it led me to be, I think, how it led me to be interested in religion is that I just, right, obviously, I had all these questions, and I would say that if anything, I was trying to find a spiritual home of sorts, and
Mm,
that didn't necessarily work out the way I imagined. I sort of maybe
mhm,
arrived at a different conclusion about things, but in the process of doing that in college, ended up taking classes in the religion department, and I took two my sophomore year by accident. One I was just interested in, but I thought I was kind of taking it as a history class, and it was a history of
mm,
Christianity class. And the other was, Columbia, my undergrad, had all of these different core curriculum requirements.
okay.
But its way of doing non-Western traditions at the time was you had to take a two-course sequence of some sort, basically. And, you could take these different courses in like non-Western whatever. So I
Mm.
took the Introduction to Asian Religions. So
Oh,
I was
mhm,
taking both of these classes in the fall semester of my sophomore year. And
mm.
by the end of it, I realized I really love studying religion. Like I do, like I
Oh,
find it really fascinating,
cool.
right? Like I'm like, oh, okay, this is a field for bringing together a bunch of questions I've had,
Mm,
not just about spirituality or belief as we would think of it, but about sort of history and culture and
mhm. Yeah,
communities and the sort of ways that social movements happen, that social change happens, like
totally.
that religion was this really amazing field for thinking about a bunch of things in concert,
Mhm.
in a bunch of different ways. And so that's what I think brought me to study religion. And
Love
then I
it.
think then when I tell if thinking about what I mentioned about my own background and growing up, then I think you can start to see how I saw the study of religion as an opportunity to try to make sense of
Mm-hmm.
what I'd like to think of. I don't know if you've seen or heard Barbara Sosaita's new book, Sanctuary Everywhere, or
I
heard about
did
her book.
see that.
Yeah.
Right, right, right. I did see the
Yeah.
post about it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
One of the things she talks about is how migrants are ethnographers. Like they have to be, right? Like you
Mm.
have to be
Wow.
engaged in this sort of,
Wow.
study and examination of another cultural context. You have to become a participant observer. You have to try to break
Mm.
down and learn the codes and sort of make sense of this unfamiliar culture.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a way in which, right, growing up between two cultures as I did, and then observing all these different cultures around me, I was always a kind of ethnographer, and I was
Mm-hmm.
always trying to puzzle together different pieces of cultural meaning
Mm-hmm.
and I was just, I think, fascinated with all of the different ways people had of making meaning together. And
Totally.
in and so, like, that's in a big picture way. I think that's what the study of religion is about. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what the study of scriptures is about.
Mm.
But
Love
I would not have thought of myself as someone who was going to study scriptures when I started studying religion. If we go back to what did I say? I said I did not enjoy reading the Bible. And I did not enjoy listening to people talk about the Bible. Um, like, I knew stories from the Bible. Obviously, we grow up ritually telling some of them
Mm-hmm.
as part
Mm-hmm.
of culture, as part of religious practice. But like actually sitting with the biblical text, I like never as a kid sat and read it and was like, oh, this is spiritually powerful.
Yeah.
Like, never.
So,
So, um,
wow.
I'd say like now on the other side of things, there are texts in the Bible that I can appreciate and I can appreciate
Mm-hmm.
things about it. But when I was young, that was never like where I felt spiritually moved. It was like almost never coincident with reading a biblical passage of any sort. And the
Mm-hmm.
idea that people found spiritual power in reading religious texts, like to some extent, I think that just baffled me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I had felt religious power in reading other kinds of texts, religious power before visual art, religious power in listening to
Mm.
music. For me, like the moments where I probably felt the most spiritual in church would, I like sang in the choir as a kid. It was probably those moments, like singing with music, like that I could
The
understand. And
aesthetic
the
through
aesthetic
beauty?
for
What?
sure, like those things, yeah, definitely that. uh and and there are people who obviously find like the Bible really beautifully written. I was not that person. Like
This is so
maybe.
crazy. Like, I had no idea.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
had no idea. This is fascinating. Oh my gosh.
So maybe
Wow.
Psalm 23, like I'd be like, maybe that was something that I was like,
Yeah.
that's really beautiful and really
Yeah.
powerful. Right. But that was basically it. But then
Okay.
I'm in my master's program. I'm in Union Theological Seminary in New York. I am, getting a master's degree in religion, thinking about, weighing a couple of different career paths. Because I'm at this Protestant seminary, like that's the moment when I become the way you described, like in different waves. That's the moment I become serious Catholic. Like I become super involved with Corpus Christi Church, which is the Catholic church
I love it.
across the street.
Mm.
I like am the like young adult like coordinator, right? Like that's the sort
That's
of
great.
moment when I become very involved, like
Mhm.
with a parish and with church life. And
Amazing.
it is in this moment when I'm in this Protestant seminary context. Um, I love languages, so I
Mhm.
took Hebrew and Greek for fun. That's
Of course you did.
like literally how I would
Oh my
describe it. I
gosh.
took
I
Hebrew
love
and
it.
Greek for fun. But at the time that I was at the seminary, Vincent Wimbush was there, and
Oh,
his research,
wow.
he's a brilliant man, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known in my life. He had been just a really solid New Testament scholar, wrote his first book on Paul, the worldly ascetic, really worked on asceticism in early Christianity in the ancient world. And then this is before I knew his work, had a kind of, as he would describe it, just a sort of intellectual crisis at midlife, and really felt like he needed to address the questions that were really pressing on his mind that had sort of driven him to become a scholar in the first place. And so that's when he engaged, and he started to do the work that became the African Americans in the Bible Conference, and then this massive volume that was produced after it. And I read his introductory essay to African Americans and the Bible, and it was just intellectually life altering. It completely made me rethink so many things. I still sometimes go back to that essay and feel like there are just things in it that I didn't even get or understand at the time. But it's just completely transformative. And his approach to the study of scriptures in general, like, it just really captured my interest. And I think it allowed me to engage in the kind of questions that I have, which I think aren't, as we were talking about a little bit before the actual conversation started, right? They're not as neatly disciplinarily circumscribed, and they're not conscribed as neatly by time and by geography. So it allowed me to engage in what I think of as a kind of looking at aspects of religion and culture in a deep time perspective, like having a sort of conversation with the past, with how we construct the past, and then but also like being very attuned to modernity, the world since 1492, and what the sort of role of religion has been in shaping the world we have now, and the way things are now. So yeah, that's how so like when I study scripture, when I say that like I'm a New Testament scholar, I don't mean it in the way that people might take that to mean. When I talk about the study of scriptures, I'm interested not so much merely in trying to understand the meanings of specific text, but more what Vincent Wimbush would describe the meaning of meaning seeking in relationship to text, right? And so those are the sort of sets of questions that drive me.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to human beings have always sought meaning, or have sought to explain, natural phenomena. Why do, trying to understand death, trying to understand illness, trying to understand like tragedy, all these things are very human searches, and they appear across cultures, across time. And I mean, more and more, I'm like, time is an illusion. I think that just this time is much more malleable than I think that we realize, right? Especially as you were mentioning 1492. I absolutely believe in like ancestral trauma, those kind of things. More and more, I believe in like past lives. I mean, I don't know, man. It's just like, it might sound very woo woo, but there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. There's more than meets the eye, for sure. And then as far as scripture, so I love it. So this is so interesting. Yes, I mean, as you know, when people talk about like the Bible, I had to like deep sigh.
I know.
No, people act like it, it was like a printed single, manuscript that fell out of the sky, in English for all of us to consume. No, like there is so much more to it. There's so much history. Translation in and of itself, for anyone who knows like more than one language, you really understand how meaning gets lost, the change of a word, the context, it all makes a completely different story. And so it's unfortunate, I think, when people do such a literalist reading of scripture or certain stories in scripture, right? Really, usually to justify their own bias or justify their own homophobia or whatever it is, right? It's a problem.
Yeah.
Um, and like, so for me, actually, one of my favorite stories, and it's, you know, it's imperfect in itself in its own way. One of my favorite stories is the book of Job,
Yeah.
because Job has the audacity to ask, like, what's up, God? You know, like, what, why am I a good man and everything is a
Yeah.
disaster right now?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, that's a good question,
Why did
right?
you punish me on a fucking whim? Sorry.
Exactly. It was like
Sorry.
a bet. It was like, okay, bet.
Yeah.
Let's see what the guy does, right? There's a lot
Yeah.
there, you know.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
little bit disturbing, you know, as
Mhm.
far as like disturbing in the sense of, I
Yeah.
think it like rattles our concepts of God, or our concepts
Yeah.
of the omniscient, you know, omnipresent, you know, the good and
Yeah.
gracious God, or Zeus figure, Zeus, right? The
Yeah.
Zeus figure that we have in our heads, most of us, anyway. So
Yeah.
that's one of my favorites, honestly. And then juxtaposed with like the very sensual, sexual Song of Solomon.
Yeah.
I'm here for it. You know what I mean? Like, I
Yeah.
think that is, I'm actually grateful. You know what I'm saying? I'm grateful that it made it, as we talk about the canon,
Yeah.
right? I'm grateful it made
Yep.
it into the canon.
Yeah.
It's surprising to me, actually, that it made it.
Yeah. No, and I think, so to your point about what I think, to the extent that I teach Bible to my students, or I engage it in the way that people might think of in a more classical sort of way, is that I do want my students to try to encounter and experience the Bible not as a singular text, right? And I and this semester I took a very clear approach to it, in that I feel that there is an authoritarian strand of reading
Mhm,
the Bible. And here
mhm,
I'm actually talking about the way Angela Parker has named it very specifically. Like, she comes from a very specific kind of Protestant background, so she contrasts authoritarian with authoritative readings of the Bible. I'm not
mhm.
necessarily interested in recovering authoritative readings of the Bible either, but but she's got her approach. But she does talk about the sort of authoritarian relationship with Scripture, and I think that when people have, like you said, you have to take a breath. I think when people have an especially traumatic relationship with the Bible or other scriptural texts, right? Be that the Quran or parts of the Vedas or
Yeah.
whatever
Other sacred
your
text.
tradition,
Sure. Mhm,
I think part of it comes down to kinds of authoritarian relationships that people have
mhm,
had with these
mhm,
biblical texts. And that what we've seen with biblical texts in modernity is especially this history of engagement by people from dominant cultural positions justifying their violent oppression of other communities.
totally.
That is, and so like I teach the sort of strategies for reading the
Mhm,
Bible to justify and oppose enslavement alongside the strategies
mhm,
to justify homophobia, because they're
mhm,
very related, right?
mhm,
And these sort of
totally.
toxic, authoritarian, dominating ways of
Dangerous.
relating. Yeah.
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 I remember, I remember like I was like floored when I learned that, in the South, like during chattel slavery, like, oh, see right here, slaves
Yeah.
obey your masters. We're all
Yep.
good. And like, what? Like that. I was
Yep.
like, oh no. I was like, oh no, this is so bad. This is so dangerous.
Yeah.
And it's, unfortunately, there are places in which scripture is used as
Yeah.
a weapon in that very same way, you
Yeah.
know, till now, like to this day,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
So,
No,
oh,
and that, and that I think that is, I think especially because of the side of modernity that we are on, that
mm,
is one very powerful form of relating to the
mhm,
Bible
mhm.
that we really still experience in the world around us. But I
Yeah.
think what you were pointing to by talking about Job, by talking about the Song of Solomon,
Mm,
Ecclesiastes,
mhm.
some of these other texts that are in the canon. And even what I try to point to is I actually spend a lot of time when I'm teaching the unit on the Hebrew Bible, just reading a few select passages of Genesis and
Mm.
Exodus. Because even in those first two books of the Torah, you
Yes.
have preserved different voices, different
Mhm.
histories, different
Mhm.
traditions. And what I try to, in terms of thinking about the Bible in a deep time perspective, what we can try to think about is, why do we even have a Bible at all? Right? And for me,
Ooh,
we have, yeah,
that's deep.
like, why do we have a Bible at all? For
Mm.
me, we have a Bible because of the experiences of oppression, of forced migration, of exile, of diaspora, of
Mhm.
a particular set of communities
Mhm.
historically. And having a Bible was a coping mechanism. It was a strategy. It was a survival strategy for a community facing annihilation. And that was how they survived. So, yeah.
1,000%. And so this
Yeah.
is incredible. And I love what you said because this really connects. So for example, when I'm teaching in the, in the Central American Studies courses, of course, we're talking about migration, we're talking about immigration policy, all these things.
Yeah.
And it's like, I hope you all realize that for some of these families, their faith, their religious practices, them carrying a rosary across the border is literally giving them life, is literally like helping them survive each day,
Yeah.
or having like a small Bible in their
Yeah.
bag. Like, and I say that to say that it's very easy to judge, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy to judge. And I think you'll know where I'm going with this. There's this like, I don't know if it's like I don't know if it's like the intellectual or the elite or however you want to call it that kind of poo-poos people that are religious or that are faithful,
Yeah.
as like, oh, they're so ignorant, right? This sense of like, oh, they're
Yeah.
ignorant, they're just
Yeah.
poor things, they don't know better, they don't know that it's all like fake and like, God
Yeah.
in the sky is not going to save you, whatever.
Yeah.
However, whatever flavor you want to take it. But I'm
Yeah.
like, no, that is so disrespectful.
Yeah.
Like,
Condescending.
it
So,
is super condescending.
yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
look closer.
Yeah.
Look closer at, for example, I'm thinking of Nancy Pineda Madrid's book on suffering, salvation, and Juarez.
Yeah.
The pink crosses,
Yeah.
hello, like the crucifixion of the feminicide, it's right
Yeah.
there. Like
Yeah.
it's clear as day.
Yeah.
Um, that connection between just the hope of liberation, the continued fight for justice, like in its many forms.
Yeah.
But yeah, the fact that people really they rely on their faith, to
Mhm.
make it through the day sometimes. So yeah.
Well, and that, no, and that I think that that those acts of faith in the present, and what they have in common with what I think are the reasons that you got this amazing diverse Bible. And just also to say that when I said that I didn't appreciate the Bible as literature when I was young, I didn't read the book
Mhm.
of Job. I think Job is actually a really great work of literature, right? So, and I think there's a
Yeah,
lot to be said for it.
totally.
But I think that what people did there and what they do when they carry around the Bible, when they, I was thinking about the art project that Barbara Sosai talks about in her book Sanctuary Everywhere, of putting up
Mhm.
crosses.
Mhm.
I think it's this Colombian artist who puts up crosses where migrants were known to have died in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert, and and sort of, and even though knowing that they'll be washed away by the elements, right? That they'll sort of
Mhm.
become part of nature. And the power of doing that, because what I think for communities that experience, and for any person really
Mhm.
experiencing certain kinds of duress,
Yeah.
it's not simply that this provides some feudal hope or some opiate of the masses. It is really a way of knowing. This is where I go very Jose Munoz, Cruising
Okay.
Utopia.
Mhm. Mhm.
This is
Mhm.
where people taste and experience and know however fleetingly, a
Mm,
better world, a bigger world, a
mhm.
better world. They experience and perceive and can speak about in those moments something greater that's
Mm.
possible. And I
Ooh,
think that
touched us.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that,
Yeah, it's
and
beautiful.
in whatever collective wisdom there was in the
Mm.
centuries of forging the biblical canon that we have, there was a wisdom to preserve some diversity in those texts,
Mhm,
some immense
mhm, mhm,
diversity,
mhm.
some immense
Yes, yes,
diversity.
yes,
Uh,
yes.
yeah,
You know what? Like this came to me several years ago. I think it was like when I was teaching and things. I was like, wow, Scripture really has everything. Scripture has everything. It has war. It has
yeah,
horrible leadership
yeah,
and kings. It has people that don't want to be leaders that are God's like, you better go take care of this.
yeah,
There's love. There's the animal kingdom. I mean,
yeah,
it is really kind of incredible to think about. Like it's there. Like in some way, shape, or form. It's really um experience of a widow. I mean,
yeah,
it's there. Like it's
yeah,
beautiful. It is really amazing.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
this is so great, Jackie.
yeah,
Thank you so much.
yeah.
As we wrap up, I'm gonna ask you my classic closing question. So one of my hopes with the podcast, in addition to sharing like the multitude of Latina representation, identity, the complexity of faith and religion for Latinas and Latinx people, is sort of this recovery of like the little me, right? So there's been so
Mhm.
much talk about inner child healing, the little me, that kind of thing. And so I've been asking all of my guests if they would share their wisdom as far as like what advice would you give to young Latinas today, or what advice you would give to little you if you could go back in time.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. Actually, this was a real struggle. I mean, I think, there were a couple of different things that I thought about. One thing, so they're two very different things, I would
Yep,
say.
yep.
One has to do with belonging,
Mm,
and I think a lot of my life, and I think a lot of certain kinds of Latinas, for a variety of reasons, I think struggle with belonging, in a sense of belonging. And I know that I certainly did. And I think I would say that um, that's its own kind of myth. I think
mhm,
part of the human experience, that that unbelonging and being a migrant, being the child of migrants, has
mm,
actually a huge and immense part of the human experience. It's a huge and normal part of the human
mhm,
experience,
mhm,
going back to our deepest, most ancient
mm.
ancestors. You
Totally.
know, being on the move, being the child of people on the move,
Mm,
and moving around and trying to learn to balance between environments and cultures. It's challenging and it's hard, and it's
mhm,
also so much more immensely normal than
mhm.
the world around us makes us think. And
Right.
that if we take something like the Bible and we think of it supposedly as this sort of static text that one group owns, we've really missed, like I said, how it was actually produced really by communities on the move and under duress. And it's a real witness to those long and deep histories. That would be one thing. But I think
Mm,
the other
mhm,
thing I would say, and this is completely, in some ways it's different, in some ways it's not,
mhm.
it's to remember that life is both longer and shorter than you think it is. And I
Ooh.
say this from middle age, and I think it was that, like,
Mhm,
when um, I think I was, I think there have been a lot of times in life when I was really worried about making the exact right choice in the moment. And I was afraid about what would happen if I
mm,
didn't make the exact right choice or do or
mm.
say the exact right thing.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that life is longer than that. there are lots of opportunities, there are lots of
Okay.
ups and
Yeah.
downs, right? Like if you say or do the wrong thing today, there is always tomorrow,
Mm,
right? And
it's beautiful.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, there will be other times. But when I say that it's also shorter, I mean that that anxiety that I think I had about making the wrong choice
Mm-hmm.
could sometimes mean that I didn't enjoy other things about the moment I was in the way that
Mm-hmm.
I should have, right? And
Yes.
so that like trying to be present and uh, part of what I think you were pointing to, going back to the aesthetic, the power of the aesthetic, being present and really being open to witnessing to the beauty and the power of the diversity of life that's around
Mhm.
us, that I think that's something that passes by way too easily and too quickly.
Totally. Totally. It's true. Like I love that. I love what you've shared. Yeah, it's amazing. I think that maybe this wisdom comes as we get older. The sense of, wow, everybody was going through something, right?
Yeah.
So thinking back to like high school, be like, oh, I was going through
Yeah.
this, and then you start talking, it's like, really? I
Yeah.
didn't know you had insecurity about that. Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that was going on. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh man, we all had something, right? In other
That's
words,
right.
like we're not
Yeah.
alone. That we feel very alone, but we're not really alone. That
Yeah.
life is, life has its ups and downs. That's part of life, literally. And
And then all
I
these
totally
people who
get it.
look like they got their shit together, like
No,
that's
they don't.
that's right.
Life. It's
That's
a
right.
front. Yeah, it's true. It's true. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's so yeah, it's so man. I mean, it's really fascinating because like so for example, like it's this idea of like the grass is always greener, right? That's
Mhm.
another issue is like looking and be
Yeah.
like, oh man, I wish I had that. Oh man, I wish I was doing that. It's like, well, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't know what they've been through,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I love what you've shared. This is really beautiful. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Dr. Hidalgo.
Thank
You're
you, Lauren. Dr.
amazing.
Guerra. It was great to get to spend a little bit of time with you and
Yes, yes, yes.
be
Central
welcomed in
Americans. Yeah. Central American
this.
brilliance. That's awesome. Oh my
uh,
goodness. Yay. This is so good. So, folks, thank you for joining us today on Gold Tips and God podcast. Don't forget, you can listen to episodes wherever you listen to your podcast. So that includes Spotify, um, iTunes, iHeart, all the places where you listen to podcasts. I also have the video interviews available on YouTube, so you can catch those videos there. I release new episodes every Wednesday. So I hope you can join us. Please spread the word, like, share, and subscribe. And thank you again. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.